Hello and welcome to this PowerPoint on democracy and political participation. Along with this PowerPoint, there'll be one or two activities that I'll be asking you to do as well. So the first part is just going to be recapping some of the work we've done already. So here's a definition of democracy: a system of rule based on people, on government, of the people, by the people, and for the people. What do we mean by of the people? Well, it's elected politicians pass laws which people must obey. By the people, everyone, regardless of race, gender or class, should be allowed to stand for office. And finally, for the people, elected politicians should govern on behalf of the people. This literally means rule by the people. And two key areas of this is political equality and political participation, which we'll be looking at later. And of course, as we've seen, there's two types of the democracy: direct and representative. What is the importance of democracy? As I've said before, and you can make notes on this: protects freedom, protects minorities, controls government power, involves popular participation, which, as I say, we'll be talking about later, and disperses power more widely. Add these notes to your notes from last time. And here is a recap of the strengths of direct democracy and representative democracy. Again, make these notes from your add these notes to your work from last time. So here's a short activity for what I'd like to do. Have a look at this and have a go at it. Stop this transmission, this program, have a go at this, and then resume. Now that you've resumed, here is another activity that I'd like you, or a series of activities that I'd like you to do. So have a go at these as well. Again, stop the transmission program and have a go at these, and then resume. So what do we mean by political participation? Remember, I said this is what we're going to be looking at. Well, it's about ways of voting, joining parties, pressure groups, and standing for political office. And it means that there is a quid pro quo here, which means that not only do we have rights, but we have obligations as well. We have to do certain things. This is sometimes known as communitarianism. It sometimes also comes into what is known as the big society. This is something that David Cameron, the Prime Minister, between 2010 and 16, said was important, that as the state receded, that the citizens should replace the state. So in other words, for example, in his case, it was where there were no more local libraries. It was run by the local communities rather than authorities. Of course, there are problems with participation. There are, for example, as we're going to see, turnout in elections has been falling, as there has been with membership of political parties, and also with partisan de-alignment, which is something we looked at last time, if you remember. So how can it be increased? I know you're not in groups, but on your own, have a go at this, and then stop the transmission, and then see what you've come up with. So here are some examples here. We could have referendums, as we've seen in 2016. We have recall elections, whereby MPs who the local constituents don't feel is doing as best as they should be doing, therefore can be recalled, and a by-election is called. We can have primaries, whereby local people can choose the representatives of each of the different parties. Online petitions, citizen juries, where groups of people with differing viewpoints can come together to look at a particular aspect and come to some sort of conclusion which politicians may or may not use. Focus groups, lowering the voting age, and compulsory voting. Some of these we will be looking at a bit later. So, what do we mean by democracy and participation? Well, first of all, we need to understand what is a democratic country, and this is something you can consider a bit later on. Democratic country, in terms of what I mean by that, is in terms of Britain, the UK. A democratic country is where the major decisions that affect society are made by the people, whether directly or indirectly. Each person has an equal right to make their opinion count. The more popular consent or agreement on a policy, law, representative or government, the more legitimate it is. And that is a key term there, legitimacy. And that is what we'll come back to a bit later. In a representative democracy, which is what we have here, individuals, the citizens, can be involved in various different ways. Voting in elections, referendums, joining political parties, joining pressure groups, becoming activists, and taking part in political consultation exercises. What is political participation? Well, it's got to be this concept here about what touches all should be approved by all. Edward I on the coin of the Model Parliament in 1295. The all is assumed to be the citizens of the state, and what touches is assumed to be the political decisions that affect their lives, and therefore the approval has to come from the ordinary citizens. Therefore, political participation is the requirement for citizens to be involved in the political decisions making of the state in which they live. However, in direct democracy, every citizen has the chance to make an impact on the decisions before a citizen body. So, in other words, referendums is a key aspect of that. Political participation, representative democracy, as it says there about Edmund Burke, argued that representatives should act according to their conscience and not in response to the wishes of the constituents who elect them for their judgment. So, in other words, rather than a direct democracy, MPs should follow their conscience. We see this again and again with certain different issues. For example, leaving the EU, and also capital punishment, the death penalty, whereby often there has been majorities for the death penalty, but MPs go with their conscience and vote against anything that might come up that wants to bring it back. This obviously raises issues about how democratic things like the House of Commons are. It's very important to not confuse democracy with participation. So, for example, in communist societies, quite often there would be elections, but there would either be one party to vote for, or there would be a collective group of parties, but they were all backed by the Communist Party and would join some form of coalition with the Communist Party after the election has been declared. So we have a two-party system in our country as a result of first past the post, and since 1918, the end of the First World War, it's been by and large between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. This has sometimes the two parties have converged. So, for example, as part of the post-war consensus between 1945 and about 1979, and more recently, probably round about the late 90s to the 2000s. Although there's been a great divergence between, say, about 2010. Pressure groups, these are, as I said before, is something important to be involved in. They can be anything from things like Friends of the Earth. It can be involved with the NHS, for example, but it can also be organisations that want to pressurise the government into, for example, changing laws. And sometimes some of these can be very powerful. So, for example, things like the smoking lobby or the oil lobby, basically organisations, companies come together, work together to try and put pressure on governments to try and alter laws that may harm them. Sometimes also certain groups are seen as more powerful than others. So, for example, the IOD, the Institute of Directors, or the CBI, Confederation of British Industry, is seen as more powerful than, say, the Trades Unions Congress, which represents the workers, whereas obviously the CBI and IOD represent the employers. And of course, there's a mismatch there. There's also a problem of what we call the democratic deficit. Voting has been going down. In 1950, the turnout was 83.9%. In 2001, it was 59.4%. You can see quite a dramatic fall there. Since then, it has gone up by about 10 percentage points, or just less than, but still well under what it was, for example, in 1979, which was 79%. Also, there's very few people turn out for things like what used to be European elections, but certainly local elections, police commission elections, 15.1% as well. In fact, when we look at the EU referendum of 2016, actually only 72% have turned out for that. Further evidence of democratic deficit in terms of when we think about how many people are involved with parties. I know in 1980 it says there that 4.1%, 1.69 million people involved in parties. It doesn't seem much, but it's actually gone down since then. So it's 1.7% of the people are members of political parties, around about a million. Although there has been a steady rise, it's worth considering why you think that has happened. It can be argued that a lack of participation has reduced active politics to an elitist pursuit. So 90% of MPs hold a university degree, when in fact in the general population it's around about 40 to 50%. And 35% of MPs were privately educated, when in fact only 7% of the general population went to a private school. Also, the system we have, first past the post, it can be considered in many ways that this is a problematic issue in terms of democratic deficit. So, for example, Doncaster Central has been Labour for at least 50 years. You could consider voting Conservative or any other party a wasted vote. So what's the point of voting if you're never going to change anything in that constituency? Also, we have undemocratic elements within our system. The House of Lords, a hereditary monarchy. I know the EU, which we're out of now, was seen as unrepresentative. And also, in terms of local government, 55% of income still comes from Westminster, which controls what that money is spent on in many ways. So there's limited autonomy actually at local councils. So what has happened, and what could we do more? Well, we could have televised debates, which has happened, but how impactful they are, we're unsure of. Changing the electoral system was rejected, so we're still stuck with first past the post. We could go with compulsory voting, such as in Australia, but that's seen as illiberal. And also maybe reducing the voting age to 16. We're going to talk about both of those a bit later on. So how do we enhance democracy? Well, here are the 4 points for and against. Make notes on these. So stop the programme and make notes on these and make a conclusion which way you go. And the same goes for digital democracy here. Look at the points for and against, come to a conclusion, and after you've made your notes on it, and then proceed with the programme. And finally, lowering the voting age again. Have a look at these to stop the programme, make your notes on it, and come to a final conclusion on this yourself. So, what can be done? So, political participation is generally seen as necessary for a healthy civic society, but there seems to be very little wanting to be involved. So, how do we square the circle? Maybe changing the election, the type of elections we have. First past the post, for example. So, it needs to, in other words, to engage the citizens. Do we have too cynical a view of politicians? Are parties struggling to project a distinctive characteristics of policies? You could say in some ways that Jeremy Corbyn was very successful in galvanising the youth vote and getting young people involved. In fact, the Labour Party is one of the largest parties in Europe, and certainly the largest party in this country at this moment. Maybe a less sceptical media might also help as well. So very quick look at what is a liberal democracy. Here are some key points here. Make a note of these, and then finally have a think about whether does Britain actually fit in with these, and then make your own conclusion. Have a look at what these concepts mean, and then write your own conclusion. Does Britain map these kind of criteria? And if it does, how far though? Consider how far. Okay, thanks for listening.